Hello and welcome to the Shahja Voice podcast. We're here at Exposure International Photography Festival 2024. I'm your host, Neale Bailey, and I'm sitting with Nicole Tung today. So Nicole, born in Hong Kong, graduated college in the United States in 2009, and you became a conflict photographer in 2011. Obviously, you've had an extraordinary career to bring you here to us at Exposure. So maybe bring us along on your career where you started.
I finished, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure.
We're happy to have you here.
So when I finished university, I'd majored in journalism and history. I started freelancing in New York pretty much as soon as I graduated, and I knew that I wanted to work in international reporting in some capacity and somewhere in the Middle East region. I've always had a fascination with the history, the culture of all the different countries in the region. So when I started freelancing, I was trying to figure out how I could finally make my way over. And of course, when 2011, the Arab Spring began, I was watching very closely what was happening in Tunisia. And then when the protests were taking place in Egypt, I was like, okay, I'm going to go. And I didn't go with an assignment. I went there. I knew a few photographers who were there already covering it. I arrived the night before Mubarak resigned, and I kind of caught the tail end of that particular moment in time, in history, and people were very jubilant. They were celebratory. And then everything started to happen in Libya at roughly the same time. So my next thought was, well, how do I get to Libya? Never really knew anything about the country. It was, of course, closed off for a good 40 years.
Who were you working for at the time when you were in Egypt? Just selling freelance or looking for clients?
Yeah, exactly. So I was looking for clients and I was trying to license my photos as a freelancer.
So you have a big learning curve. I mean, overseas, trying to figure out how to make a living at this. Yeah.
I had contacts to a few editors, but they already had photographers there and I was just super green. So I think they kind of didn't really know if they could trust me working on the ground there.
So you went into Libya after?
Yeah, I went to Libya. I went there by road, first a train to Alexandria, then by a bus, this little microbus. And there were very few journalists at that time getting in, or they were trying to get in, but it was quite, such early days that you didn't know how you were going to get in or what you would see when you got in. But I walked across the border myself and then very luckily bumped into a few other journalists and human rights researchers. So from that point, I got in and really started covering the revolution, the protests, and then very shortly after, a few weeks, the start of the war.
How long did you spend in total in Libya?
On and off for the next 10 months. I stayed for about a month at a time, then I would leave for a few weeks, then I would go back in.
When you left, would you come back stateside or would you go to...
I went back, so at that time I had a sort of a base in France because I'd moved there temporarily. Long story.
As you do, right?
Yeah, as you do. And because I was trying to make my way over to the Middle East and trying to find a base. But I was still figuring things out. So when I would come out and then I would feel like I was missing something, so I'd go straight back in. And Libya covering the front line was incredibly dangerous, but I think because I was so young and new to it all, I took it seriously, but I had this feeling of invincibility. And
maybe what you didn't know is helpful.
Yeah, or I was surrounded by very veteran journalists, so I was very lucky in that way. But covering the front line, you were always at risk of being shelled or shot at and things like that. So it was quite a chaotic time.
So keep going for me now. So you finished with Libya. Was that the sort of got you onto an international stage with your work at that point, or were you still sort of having to prove yourself and keep making your connections?
When I met the Human Rights Watch researcher on the border, he was very helpful in the sense of, you're a young woman traveling by yourself. Why don't you travel with us? And and also take some photos for Human Rights Watch. And so it kind of helped me get into it a little bit in that way. And then I started picking up assignments because I met other reporters and journalists there. So that's kind of how it got started in Libya. And this is a very unusual way of doing it. It's kind of the newer model of journalism where it's very rare for you to be sent on assignment, especially when you're starting out. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I learned on the fly.
So what do you say, like the newer way? I suppose maybe the older way being you would have worked for a publication and then been sent there?
Yeah, so the old way would have been you get sent by a publication with a big budget, a boatload of cash kind of thing. And those were the days of Time Magazine, Newsweek, and the Sunday Times when they had fairly
big budgets.
Yeah, big budgets or more resources, and people could stay there for a longer time to keep covering the story.
So this must have been incredibly difficult from a sense of the fact that you've not only got to learn your craft in a very dangerous environment, you've also got to support yourself financially, figure out how to sell stuff, maintain a home somewhere. I mean, this is a very must have been an exciting but very challenging period in your life.
Yeah, it really was. And I came into the era of right when media or journalism started to really be consumed via social media, right? So like Egypt and Libya, even Tunisia, these were the Facebook revolutions. And so in many ways, of course, the internet has killed off the old model of journalism. And so me and myself and many other freelancers have had to learn on the fly, but also do things on a shoestring budget. And I think at that time in 2010, 2011, the media companies and publications were also trying to figure out this new model. So there weren't as many support networks for the freelance journalists and freelance photographers coming back from these places. Also, hostile environment training, that's a little bit more established now. That's a little bit more industry accepted and also...
But it's expensive to go through hostile environment.
Very expensive. And that's why you now get journalism advocacy organizations that push these publications to at least subsidize some of these trainings so that freelancers can afford to go and do them.
But this became a big part of your work, though, advocacy.
It did, yeah. So for the it became such a big part of my work because I had a lot of personal losses of friends and colleagues in the field. First in Libya, of two photographer friends, Chris Hondros and Tim Hetherington. And they were photographers that I looked up to. I looked at their work when I was growing up from Iraq, Afghanistan. And they were just genuinely wonderful people who were very supportive of a younger photographer such as myself. And then later on, I lost my friend James Foley in Syria. He was somebody that I met in Libya and spent months with in Syria, traveling, working on these stories about the opposition and the Free Syrian Army at that time. So that really compelled me to be an advocate for freelancers and in journalists and photographers in general, because the environment of the journalism landscape was changing, and it was necessary for the publications to take responsibility, or at least take more responsibility for the people they send out into the field.
Interesting. So currently, we'll come to your exhibition in a minute. So how are you combining your advocacy in the work with the actual work that you're doing now?
Now at the moment, I've kind of left it to other people, more capable hands, but I do still, so sometimes I'll get questions or emails from younger photographers who want to get into the line of conflict photography. And I will say, look, go and cover things in your backyard. If you happen to be at a protest, or if you're interested in kind of local news, go and do those things first, because then it gives you some experience. And if you're really concentrated on doing conflict, then go and do a hostile environment training when you've had a little bit of experience, so that you aren't going into these places completely unprepared. Because it's important to know first aid. It's important to know how you're going to react, or at least train yourself to know how to react when there's a really tough situation in front of you. So that's kind of how I make people realize it's not just as simple as don't do what I did or other people before me did, which is just go somewhere totally unprepared and hope it works out for the best.
You were lucky that you were able to have people that could help you along with that, and now you're just giving some of that back.
Yeah, definitely.
People coming in. So talk a little bit about your exhibition here at Exposure with us this year.
So the exhibition that I have here at Exposure is called As Strong as the War, As Soft as the Peace. And it's a collection of work from various places that I've covered over the years, including Libya, Syria, also of Iraq and Syria in the aftermath of ISIS being driven out of areas in Iraq and Syria, how people were adjusting and coming back to a sort of normality, even though there was still this parallel of war constantly in the background, as well as most recently Ukraine. I've spent a better part of the last 2 years working in Ukraine, Bangladesh, and Hong Kong.
So talk a little bit about some individual photographs that you have here with us and some of the meaning behind them. Maybe pick one from each of the conflict zones you've been in.
So from Libya, one of the photos that I've gotten a lot of people saying to me, wow, how did you take this photo? It was of 2 Libyan rebel fighters that were running back towards their position. They had failed to fire an RPG, and the ground beneath them is just covered in bullet shell casings. So it looks like this kind of weird carpet. And above me, I was down quite low to take this picture, but you can see these 2 hands appear in the frame, on the top of the frame, and they're shouting for them to come back because there were snipers aiming at these 2 guys. So that was one of the pictures in the exhibition. Another one from Syria and Iraq is probably one of the soldiers of the Syrian Defense Forces, and they are running across the street because what they were doing is they were hunting ISIS fighters who had escaped from prison. There was a prison break a few days before that, before I got there, and they had escaped and kind of gone into these neighborhoods nearby. So the SDF forces were trying to track them down and recapture them. There's another picture from Ukraine.
Who would you have been with at that time?
In Syria, that was 2022, early 2022. I was there with the Washington Post.
Okay, so were you on assignment then at that?
Yes.
Yeah, so things had transitioned for you that you were able to go on these assignments.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So since pretty much after Libya, because I was working so consistently in these places, and I was making kind of more consistent work and more contacts and staying in touch with editors, I was getting more assignments to do this work.
Which takes the pressure off you to be able to concentrate more on your work and doing.
Absolutely. I think what sometimes there's a misunderstanding about how we do this work, and that's why I think there's a bit of a struggle in journalism today, which is many people expect, or they're used to kind of free content and free information on the internet. And what people don't realize is that it takes an incredible amount of resources for us to do this work. We have to have the personal protective equipment like body armor and helmets, first aid kits, which are not cheap. We also have to pay the people that we work with appropriately because they're also taking the same risks that we have. They have families to support.
And you couldn't do your job without these people, fixers that are with you.
Exactly. And also as a freelancer, for most freelancers, we pay for our own equipment, cameras, computers, all hard drives.
And that stuff breaks.
That stuff breaks. It's, you have to update it every few years. So it does require a lot of resources and finances to do this. So when I was getting more regular assignments, I was saving up to buy the next camera or, paying rent and things like that. And so it was, you after a few years of doing this, you get to a point where it is easier to get work, but it's still, you still have to love it because you're not getting paid a lot of money to do this. You have to really be invested in it.
All right. So a couple more pictures from the exhibition.
There's one from Ukraine of 3 young girls who are in one of the children's hospitals in Kyiv. They were there to celebrate International Children's Day on May 1st last year. And the hospital staff had decided to try and put on a party for them, basically. They brought in mascots and face painters and clowns and all of this. So it was quite wild. But the context of it was that they held it in the cancer ward, which is underground in the basement of
security
the hospital,
purpose.
for security, because the night before, actually, nobody got any sleep. There was lots of drones, and air defense was shooting at the missiles. That particular moment of these 3 girls, 2 of them have face paint on. One of these girls with the face paint is missing a leg. She's sitting in a wheelchair. Another one of these girls has a broken arm. And the third girl, who's a little bit older, had crutches.
So these are all victims of the war.
Yeah, I think 2 of the 3 of these girls were victims of the war. And it's this supposedly happy moment because you see this face paint, but it's very jarring because you see these injuries that they have. So it's a very contrasting photo. And there's also some pictures from Bangladesh of Rohingya refugees crossing the river border into Bangladesh as well. That was in 2017. And as well as another, and the front of the exhibition, there's some other photos of Ukraine. One in particular of a couple that they were in the basement of a hospital, maternity hospital. And this was the very early days of the invasion in 2022. And this young couple, they were about to welcome their first child into the world. She was about to deliver, but she was on this mattress kind of tucked into a corner of the bunker. And her husband was holding her hand, and he was counting her contractions using his cell phone. So this was just this really beautiful, intimate moment, but it shows the fear and uncertainty of that very particular time.
The most beautiful part of life, and it's with so much horror.
Exactly.
Well, it's a beautiful exhibition. So your first time to exposure?
Yes, it is.
So give me some thoughts on your experience and what you've been seeing since you've been here.
When I first arrived, I was not expecting the scale, the quality, the standard of what's on show here. And I'm really impressed and grateful that all of these exhibitions have been given so much respect, and the photographers, the photography is printed in such a way that really gives this, it just shines. You see these pictures and you're just like, wow. And you see the scale of these pictures as well. Some are printed really big. You don't see that anymore. You know, we're so used to scrolling on our phones, and that's how we now consume photography. And when you see it in person, there's something so different and special about it.
It's always interesting to see you guys when you come here, like, sort of eyes wide open to see your work so beautifully displayed. But there's a lot of other elements that are going on here, isn't it? With sort of being part of the exposure family and the people that you're meeting. How are you feeling about some of the influences you're getting or the people you're meeting?
So I always say that you don't just get inspiration from the very same kind of work that you do. What I love about this exhibition and then this festival is that there's a lot of different kinds of photography. So just like art, just like music, reading books can influence how you see the world and therefore capture it in photography. What I love about this is that I'm seeing all different kinds of photography, and that is so inspiring to me as well. And that helps me move forward as well, because now I'm kind of so much more, engrossed and educated.
Yeah, thinking about the process of photography.
Exactly.
Any people here that you were really super looking forward to meeting?
God, there's so many.
Yeah. It's like, can you give me a short list?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of I love Paolo Verzona's work. He does a lot of portraiture, and his exhibition here is about, it's called Reimagining Dinosaurs. And he has this amazing way of using light. And when you look at these pictures, you're just like, how did he light that? Where is where are these shadows and things? And also the content of his pictures is always really interesting. And so I really enjoyed seeing his work. the work of Afshin Ismaili from Afghanistan too, of this very important time in the country's history. And there's also Daniela Zalkman. She did work on Native Americans who were victims and survivors of these boarding schools in the United States. So, Kili Yuyan also, his photos on indigenous stewards of various places around the world. So many.
It goes on, doesn't it? I think one of the things that is interesting to me is like, what will be the influence for you? There's something you'll take away from this exposure. It'll be so cool for you to come back at some point and tell us some spark of light will go off for something that'll happen in your life, and you'll be able to relate it back to your time. Enjoyable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm still thinking about that, but I think there's so many. I think it'll take a few days for all of this to sink in.
I think it'll take a bit longer than that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was just looking 10 minutes ago at Formula One racing photos.
Unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah, by Darren Heath, and
I think it's like you said though. It's just art.
It's art,
but it is motorsports at 200 and something miles per hour,
which you wouldn't kind of imagine or know, but or think of when you think of Formula One racing. I was like, oh, it's going to be a bunch of cars, but no, it's not. It's light. It's art, colors, and all of this form. So it's really interesting to see.
Yes, phenomenal. Quickly, what's next for you when you leave us?
So I'm returning to Ukraine in 2 weeks' time after exposure.
Where will you be?
I'll be, at the moment, I'm not quite sure, but probably in different areas of the country. I'll be working on some stories there, hopefully. And it's just trying to keep busy with other projects in the works as well, and pitching stories and things.
Well, Nicole, I know you've got your big speech here very shortly, so we won't hold you any longer. But thanks for stopping by at the podcast here with us. Great to see you.
It's great to see you too.